The encounter. The night was colder than usual, and Officer Greg could feel the crispness in the air biting at his skin. As he walked down the quiet street, the rhythmic sound of his boots echoed in the stillness. The city's pulse had slowed. There were no rowdy groups of teenagers loitering on corners, no loud car engines rumbling through the avenues. It was just him and the distant hum of traffic that seemed to be an echo of a world too far away for this forgotten stretch of city. Gray had worked the night shift for over a decade, and though his patrols were routine, they never truly became mundane. There was always something new, something hidden in the cracks of the streets, waiting to be uncovered. It was his job to protect this neighborhood, to keep the peace, and most of the time, that meant dealing with petty theft, late-night drunks, and the occasional domestic dispute. But tonight, something felt different. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather seemed to hang in the air, making Greg uneasy for reasons he couldn't quite pinpoint. As he passed by the old brick buildings that lined the street, his eyes scanned the familiar storefronts, their neon signs dimming in the early hours of the morning. The bars were closed, the diners long emptied, and the alleyways that snaked between buildings were mostly dark, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight. But something caught Greg's attention. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, broke through the night's quiet. A soft, stifled whimper. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt, where the comforting weight of his flashlight rested. He paused for a moment, listening intently, trying to trace the source of the sound. Another whimper, this time louder and more desperate, reached his ears. Greg's heart quickened, and a knot of unease tightened in his chest. The sound was coming from the alley behind an old boarded-up building, one that Greg knew well. He had passed by it countless times on his beat, never giving it much thought. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows long shattered, the doors rusted and locked. The alley was usually littered with discarded furniture, empty bottles, and the occasional stray animal searching for food. But tonight, there was something different. "Hello," Greg called out, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. His hand gripped the flashlight a little tighter, the beam cutting through the dark alley ahead of him. "Is anyone there?" For a moment, nothing. No response. The wind rustled through the leaves of an old tree nearby, but there was no sound from the alley. Greg felt a flicker of doubt. Had he imagined it? But then, it came again. Another whimper, this time tinged with pain. It was unmistakable. Greg's pulse quickened. His mind raced as he made his way toward the alley's entrance, his footsteps echoing off the walls of the narrow passage. He had to know what was happening. There was no mistaking the sense of urgency in the sound, a cry for help that couldn't be ignored. He approached cautiously, his flashlight dancing across the debris that cluttered the ground. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for a car to pass through. The walls on either side were dirty, covered in graffiti, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and decay. But there, at the far end, behind a pile of old cardboard boxes and broken furniture, Greg could see a shadow, something small, huddled and vulnerable. Greg's heart sank. It was a child. The boy was curled up in a corner of the alley, his body almost hidden by the tattered remnants of old garbage bags and discarded refuse. His clothes were torn and soiled, and his skin was thin, stretched tight over bones that seemed far too sharp for someone so young. The boy's face was hidden behind the dark matted hair that fell over his forehead, but Greg could see the trembling of his shoulders, the way his tiny frame shook with fear, or something else, something darker. Greg's hand shook as he shone the flashlight over the boy's body, moving slowly, trying not to startle him. The child's face, when Greg finally saw it, was drawn and gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The boy's lips were cracked, his cheeks hollow, and there was an unsettling dullness in his gaze as he looked up at Greg. "Hey, kid," Greg said softly, crouching down in front of him. He kept his voice gentle, hoping to calm the child, to let him know that he wasn't in danger anymore. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond at first, his eyes locking onto Greg's with an intensity that sent a shiver down Greg's spine. There was something strange about the boy's expression. Something guarded, something wary. The boy didn't speak, but his lips trembled, and his breathing came in short, shallow gasps. He seemed like he was on the edge of collapse, as if he had been here for days, perhaps longer, with no food or water. Greg's heart clenched in his chest. "What's your name, kid? Can you tell me your name?" The boy flinched slightly at the question, as though the sound of his name might trigger something in him. He looked down, as if ashamed, or perhaps afraid of speaking. His hands, small and shaking, clutched at the edges of his torn shirt. Greg's instincts kicked in, and he gently reached out, trying to coax the boy into speaking. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. Can you tell me your name?" After a long pause, the boy finally spoke, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Liam." "Liam," Greg repeated softly, as though testing the name. "That's a nice name, kid. Liam, I'm going to help you. You're safe now, all right." The boy didn't respond, but his body trembled less as Greg continued to speak gently, trying to soothe him. He didn't want to frighten the boy further. He knew that there was something deeply wrong here. No child should be left in an alley, abandoned and starving. And the way Liam had reacted, as though he were terrified of speaking, left Greg with more questions than answers. Greg carefully helped Liam to his feet, supporting him as the boy wobbled slightly, his legs weak and unsteady. It was clear that Liam had been on his own for some time, that he hadn't had proper care or nourishment. Greg's mind raced with questions, his thoughts beginning to spiral. Who would do this to a child? Who would leave him to fend for himself in a dark alley, surrounded by garbage? As they walked back toward the street, Greg glanced at Liam, trying to offer him some comfort, but the boy's eyes never left the ground. He was silent, his small body still trembling, and Greg couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him. What had brought him to this dark alley, to the brink of death, alone and afraid? Greg's gut told him that this was far more than an innocent case of neglect. There was something deeper, something darker at play here. But whatever it was, Greg knew that he had to get to the bottom of it. He couldn't let Liam fall through the cracks. Not this time. As they emerged from the alley and into the streetlights, Greg felt the weight of responsibility press heavily on his shoulders. He was about to uncover something that would shake the very foundation of the town, a secret that would haunt both him and Liam for the rest of their lives. And this was just the beginning. The investigation. The morning sun was a pale and distant light, filtered through a gray sky that hinted at the storm to come. Greg couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest the night before. He had dropped Liam off at the local shelter, made sure he had something warm to eat, and offered the boy as much comfort as he could, but the sense that something far deeper was at play lingered in the back of his mind. He arrived at the precinct early, before most of the department had reported in for the day. The office was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights above and the rustling of papers on his desk. The case files piled up like unspoken obligations, but Greg couldn't focus on any of them. His thoughts kept returning to Liam, the boy he had found in the alley. Who was Liam? Where had he come from? And more troubling still, why was he so terrified? Greg had seen his fair share of abused children, of neglect and hardship, but there was something different about this one. The boy's reaction had been visceral, as though speaking his name or revealing his story would open a door to something dangerous, something he was unwilling to acknowledge. Greg stood up from his desk, pacing the small room. He had to know more. He needed to understand what Liam was hiding, but first, he needed to get his hands on the information that could lead him to the boy's past. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah's number at the shelter. "Hello." Sarah's voice crackled through the receiver. "Hey, Sarah, it's Greg," he said, his voice clipped. "How's Liam doing this morning?" He's okay, I think. Sarah replied hesitantly. He's quiet, keeping to himself. He doesn't want to talk much. But he ate something, at least. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. Any chance I could speak to him again? I need to know more about where he came from. Something about this isn't adding up. There was a long pause on the other end. And when Sarah finally spoke, her tone was cautious. He's still very closed off, Greg. I'm not sure he'll open up to you. But I'll let him know you're coming. Thanks, Greg said, hanging up. He felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of the unknown. He couldn't help but feel that time was running out. Whatever had driven Liam to such depths of fear, it was a race to uncover it before it was too late. As he drove to the shelter, his mind replayed everything he had seen the night before, the boy's trembling body, his fearful eyes, the way he flinched when asked about his past. Gray had dealt with difficult cases before, but this one felt different. There was something too precise about the boy's fear, too well practiced, like Liam had been running, hiding from something far more dangerous than an abusive home life. He arrived at the shelter and parked his car, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly. The air was heavy, and the scent of wet concrete filled his nostrils as he made his way inside. Sarah greeted him with a small, tight-lipped smile, though her eyes were filled with concern. "He's in the back room," she said quietly. "I'll be right here if you need me." Greg nodded and made his way to the back of the shelter. The small room where Liam sat was sparse, with only a table and a few chairs. The boy was perched on one of the chairs, his legs swinging nervously as he stared down at the floor. His eyes flicked up when Greg entered. But he didn't speak. He had retreated even further into himself, like a turtle hiding inside its shell. "Hey, Liam," Greg said softly, closing the door behind him. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" Liam nodded wordlessly, but he didn't look up. Greg sat across from him, carefully placing his hands on the table between them. He knew that pushing too hard might make the boy shut down completely, but he couldn't let this go on. He had to get through to him somehow. "Listen," Greg began, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I know you're scared. I can see it. And I understand that you don't want to talk about your past. But I need to know what happened. Someone left you in that alley, Liam. Someone hurt you, and that's not okay. You don't have to go through this alone." The boy's hands twitched, the slightest tremor running through his fingers, as if Greg's words were scraping at something deep inside. Liam looked up for the first time, his eyes locking with Greg's, though there was a wall behind them, a wall that made it clear that the boy wasn't about to tear it down so easily. "I can't tell you," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. Greg leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so it didn't feel like an interrogation. "Why not? You're not alone anymore. You're safe, Liam." The boy looked down again, his lips pressed together as if he were struggling with an internal battle. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. Greg could see the weight of the boy's silence pressing down on him, suffocating him. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the stillness of the room. "If I tell you, they'll come for me. And they'll hurt you too." Greg's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected that. "Who will come for you, Liam?" Greg asked, his voice low and steady, masking the urgency that had suddenly spiked inside him. "Who are you afraid of?" Liam closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to shut out the fear that seemed to consume him. When he opened them again, there was a flicker of something, dread, but also a resignation that twisted Greg's stomach. "They're not just bad people," Liam said slowly, his voice trembling. They're dangerous. They know where I am. They've been watching me for a long time. If I say anything, they'll find me again." Greg's heart raced, his mind spinning with possibilities. Whoever these people were, they weren't just a stray group of criminals or an abusive family. This felt much larger, more coordinated, more ominous. Someone had put Liam through something so horrific that he was too afraid to even speak. Liam's eyes filled with tears, but he wiped them quickly, not wanting to show any more weakness. "Please, don't make me tell you. I can't. I'll get you hurt too." Greg felt a pang of sympathy, but it was drowned out by the need to get to the truth. Whatever it took, he had to protect Liam and uncover the mystery that surrounded him. He stood up and took a step closer, his voice firm but filled with understanding. "Liam," he said, "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, but you have to help me understand what's going on. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The boy flinched at the words, his face going pale as though the mere thought of trust was too much to bear. But then something in his eyes shifted, and for the first time, Liam took a deep breath and spoke again. I was in a foster home," he began, his voice cracking. "But not like the other kids. They kept me hidden. I don't know why, but they told me I had to stay quiet, stay out of sight. I thought it was just the way things were. But they weren't human. Not really." Greg felt a chill run down his spine. The boy's words made no sense, yet there was a desperation in his voice that made it clear that he wasn't making this up. Whatever he had been through, it was far worse than Greg had imagined. Before Greg could respond, a knock sounded at the door, breaking the tense silence. He turned toward the sound, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The boy's expression hardened, fear flashing across his face as he grabbed Greg's sleeve. "Please," Liam whispered urgently, "don't let them find me." The secret's unveiled. The knock at the door echoed in the quiet room like a sudden crack of thunder, a sound so unexpected that it made Greg's heart skip a beat. He turned slowly, his mind racing. Who could it be? The look on Liam's face told Greg everything he needed to know. The boy was terrified. His hands, clenched tightly in his lap, were trembling, his eyes wide with panic. Greg swallowed hard, his thoughts running at a mile a minute. He glanced back at Liam, who was still gripping his sleeve, his fingers digging into the fabric as though he could pull Greg closer to him. There was no mistaking it now. Whoever had been after Liam, whoever had made him so fearful, was close. And they were here. Another knock came, louder this time. Greg hesitated for only a second before walking toward the door, his every instinct screaming at him to protect the boy, to keep him safe from whatever lay beyond that threshold. "Stay here," Greg said, his voice firm but calm, turning to Liam. He held up a hand, signaling the boy to stay back. "I'll handle this. Just stay quiet." Liam nodded weakly, his eyes darting to the door and then back to Greg. He didn't argue, though the terror in his eyes was more evident than ever. The boy was still clutching Greg's sleeve, his grip tight as though he could draw strength from it. Greg opened the door slowly, his hand hovering near his holster, ready to act if needed. Standing on the other side was a man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses and a baseball cap that was pulled low. There was something off about him. His posture too rigid, his mannerisms too deliberate. Greg immediately felt that strange, unsettling sensation in the pit of his stomach, as though he was looking at someone who wasn't entirely human. "Can I help you?" Greg asked, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the suspicion creeping into his tone. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes hidden behind the sunglasses, making it impossible for Greg to gauge his intentions. It was as if he were sizing Greg up, studying him before making a decision. "I'm here for the boy," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. It sent a shiver down Greg's spine. "Liam." The name struck Greg like a punch to the gut, and a flash of realization hit him. This was no random visitor. The fear in Liam's eyes, the way he had reacted when the knock came, all of it made sense now. This man was part of the same force that had been after the boy. Whoever they were powerful, and they were not here to help. "Liam isn't going anywhere with you," Greg said firmly, his jaw tightening. His instincts screamed that this man wasn't who he claimed to be. He had to protect Liam, no matter what. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone used to getting what they wanted. You misunderstand, officer. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. The boy belongs with us. We've been looking for him. He's not yours to protect. The chilling words hung in the air, like a promise of something dark, something dangerous. Greg's grip on the door tightened. You're not taking him. The man's smile faded, replaced by an icy, unblinking stare. Then you're standing in the way of something far bigger than you can understand. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. The tension in the room was palpable, and Greg could hear the soft rustle of movement behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, and there stood Liam, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. The boy had heard every word, and the terror on his face was enough to make Greg's blood run cold. This wasn't just a matter of a runaway child. This was something far more sinister. Greg stepped forward, blocking the man's path. I don't care who you are or what you want with Liam, but I'm not letting you take him. You'll have to go through me first. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't seem the least bit concerned by Greg's defiance. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and his voice became lower, colder. This is your last warning, officer. Don't make me force you. Greg didn't back down. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, his eyes locked with the man's, refusing to let him past. His hand hovered near his holster, ready to draw his weapon if necessary. But even as the adrenaline surged through his veins, something inside him warned that this wasn't going to be settled by force. The man stared at him for a long moment, as though weighing his options. Finally, he sighed, as though Greg had disappointed him. Very well, the man said with a resigned shake of his head. You'll regret this. You and the boy both. With that, he turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps fading into the distance. Greg stood in the doorway, watching the man disappear into the morning fog, his mind racing. The sense of danger had not gone away. In fact, it had only intensified. Whoever this man was, whatever they were not done yet. Greg closed the door slowly, his heart still pounding in his chest. He turned to Liam, who was standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Who was that? Greg asked softly, though he already had a sinking feeling in his stomach. Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the floor, his body trembling slightly. They're not human, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. They've been after me for a long time. I don't know who they really are, but they want something from me, something I don't have. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. Greg felt a chill crawl down his spine as Liam's words sank in. The boy's fear was not just about being taken. It was about something far more terrifying. Whatever these people were, they were hunting Liam for a reason. And it wasn't just a matter of a runaway child. There was something else at play here. Something far more dangerous. Do you know what they want with you? Greg asked, his voice low and steady. He could feel the weight of the question bearing down on him. Liam nodded slowly, his face pale. I don't understand it all, but they've been watching me. They said I'm different. I don't know why, but they're trying to take me back to where they came from. They'd been tracking me ever since I left. Greg's mind spun. He had heard rumors of strange disappearances over the years, stories whispered by those who had seen things they shouldn't have, but he had never put much stock in them. But now, hearing it from Liam's lips, he couldn't ignore it. There was something profoundly unsettling about this entire situation. Liam took a shaky breath, his eyes flickering to the window, as if expecting the man to come back at any moment. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't want to get anyone else hurt. But I can't go back to them. I can't. Greg placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice firm yet compassionate. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Liam. We'll figure this out. You're not alone. But even as he spoke the words, a part of Greg's mind was already working, already thinking ahead. He needed to find out who these people were and what they wanted from Liam. And more than that, he needed to protect the boy from whatever dark forces were chasing him. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, Greg knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. A trail of darkness. The hours passed slowly as Greg paced the small office, his mind racing through a dozen scenarios at once. The encounter with the mysterious man had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. There was something wrong here, something deeper than he could have imagined. The boy, Liam, was running from something far more sinister than mere human cruelty. Whoever was after him, they had a power that stretched beyond anything Greg had encountered in his years on the force. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. The morning was slipping away, but his instincts told him that time was running out. There was a sense of urgency in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't sit idle while someone hunted a scared boy. Greg had always believed in protecting the vulnerable, but Liam's case was beyond anything he had prepared for. The more he thought about the boy's words, the more questions piled up, and the fewer answers he had. The boy had said they weren't human. They had been hunting him for a long time. Greg didn't know if Liam's fear was stemming from paranoia or if he was speaking the truth, but the gravity in his voice couldn't be ignored. Something about it resonated with Greg, something that felt wrong, deeply wrong. He glanced over at Liam, who was still sitting quietly in the corner of the room, his face pale. The boy had barely spoken since their conversation, lost in his thoughts, his eyes darting to the window every now and then as though expecting someone to appear. Greg could see the exhaustion in his features. The boy was running on empty, both physically and emotionally. "Hey," Greg said softly, walking over to where Liam was seated. He crouched down to be at eye level with him, trying to offer a comforting presence. "You okay?" Liam looked up, his eyes glassy. He nodded, though it was clear that his mind was elsewhere. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running," Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere. They'll find me. I don't know how, but they always know where I am." Greg's heart tightened at the fear in the boy's voice. He could see the toll that running had taken on Liam, physically and mentally. But there was no question about it. This wasn't something the boy could deal with alone. If someone or something was after him, Greg had to make sure they were stopped. He couldn't let Liam face this danger without his help. "We're going to figure this out," Greg reassured him. "You're not alone. I promise you, we're going to make sure you're safe." Liam didn't respond, his eyes distant, as if he was lost in the vastness of his own thoughts. Greg gave him a moment before standing up. "I need to make a few calls. Stay here, okay?" Liam didn't move, though he gave a weak nod. Greg stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. As he walked down the narrow hall of the shelter, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number that he had been reluctant to call, a name he hadn't uttered in years. "Detective Monroe," the voice on the other end said, sounding wary but professional. "Monroe, it's Greg," he said, his voice low. "I need a favor." There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "What kind of favor?" "The last time you called me, it involved paperwork that took me days to clean up. I need you to dig into something for me. Something personal. I've got a kid here, a boy named Liam. I think he's being hunted by something. Not human." Monroe let out a disbelieving laugh. "Not human? What are you talking about, Greg?" Greg pressed the heel of his palm against his forehead, frustrated. "I know it sounds insane, but I'm telling you, there's something off about this. The kid's terrified, Monroe. And he's not just scared of people, he's scared of something bigger than that." Monroe's tone softened, though the skepticism remained. "All right, I'll bite. What do you need?" Greg paused, feeling the weight of the request. "I need you to check into anything involving Liam. Family, foster care, missing persons, whatever you can find. But here's the catch. I'm pretty sure whoever's after him is more than just a threat to him. They're dangerous, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Monroe's voice grew serious. If you're right, Greg, this is above our heads. You sure you want to dive into this? I don't have a choice, Greg replied, his voice firm. The kid doesn't deserve this. Whatever this is, it needs to end. After a long pause, Monroe spoke again. Fine. I'll see what I can do. But don't expect anything immediate. This is off the books, you know. Greg nodded, already knowing that Monroe was about to embark on a rabbit hole of research. There were no official channels to pursue a case like this, not when it seemed to fall outside the realm of possibility. Just do what you can. And Monroe, be careful. I've got a feeling this goes deeper than anyone realizes. With that, Greg hung up, his mind already moving ahead to the next step. He needed more information. He needed to know what kind of people, or creatures, Liam was running from, and why. But for now, the only thing he could do was wait for Monroe's findings and keep Liam safe. As the hours dragged on, the shelter remained eerily quiet. Greg sat in the small office, his phone in hand, waiting for any news. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the occasional rustle of papers as he shuffled through case files, hoping to distract himself from the weight of the unknown. But the waiting was driving him mad. Suddenly, the phone buzzed in his hand. It was Monroe. Got something for you. Monroe's voice crackled through the receiver. This isn't easy to explain, but you need to hear this. Greg sat up, his heart racing. Go ahead. Monroe hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. There's a file on Liam. He's been through several foster homes, but there's something strange about it. He wasn't reported as a runaway when he was younger. He just disappeared. He's been in and out of care since he was 7, but nothing about his history adds up. No records of his parents, no birth certificate. It's like he didn't exist before then. Greg's breath caught in his throat. Wait, what do you mean he didn't exist? Exactly that, Monroe continued. There's no trace of him before his time in foster care. It's like he appeared out of nowhere. And the records were intentionally wiped. The only thing I could find was a reference to an old government program, one that was supposedly shut down years ago. It's called Project Sentinel. Greg felt the room spin for a moment. Project Sentinel. What does that have to do with Liam? I don't know yet, Monroe replied, his voice grim. But there's a mention of it in one of the files. It's a classified operation, something that was swept under the rug. And get this, there's a connection between this program and some weird disappearances that happened around the same time Liam showed up on the radar. Whatever Project Sentinel was, it's linked to people or things that weren't supposed to be here. The implications of Monroe's words hit Greg like a ton of bricks. Project Sentinel. It sounded like something out of a government conspiracy theory. But the connection to Liam, to whatever was hunting him, made everything feel horribly real. Greg, you need to be careful, Monroe warned, his tone serious. Whatever this is, it's dangerous. And I don't think it's just a few rogue agents you're dealing with. This goes way beyond that. Greg closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. Liam wasn't just a runaway child. He was part of something much larger, something far darker. And the people, or things, that were after him weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He took a deep breath, his mind already turning toward the next step. He needed to confront Liam with this new information. It was time to learn the truth. But more than that, Greg had to prepare for whatever was coming next, because he had a feeling that the real fight was just beginning. Into the unknown. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as Greg paced back and forth, the weight of Monroe's findings pressing on him. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Liam and the mysterious Project Sentinel. What could it all mean? What kind of operation would leave a child like Liam with no trace of his past? And why was someone, or something, hunting him so relentlessly? His mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about protecting a runaway kid. This was something much bigger. Whoever was behind Liam's mysterious past wasn't just interested in finding him. They wanted to control him, manipulate him for some unknown purpose, and Greg had no intention of letting that happen. He needed answers. He needed to get to the heart of Project Sentinel. What was it? Who were the people involved? And most importantly, why had it all been covered up so thoroughly? Greg knew that going down this road could get dangerous, very dangerous. But there was no turning back now. Liam's life depended on it. Greg glanced over at the boy, who was still seated in the corner, his face drawn with exhaustion and anxiety. Liam had been through so much already, and now the full weight of their situation was starting to sink in. Greg couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward him. No child should have to live like this, constantly hunted, constantly afraid. It was his duty to protect him, no matter what it took. Taking a deep breath, Greg walked over to Liam and knelt in front of him. The boy looked up at him with wide, haunted eyes, as though he had been expecting this moment, the moment when the truth would come crashing down on them both. "I've learned something," Greg said gently, keeping his voice calm. "Something about where you came from, and why you're being hunted." Liam's gaze flickered, and Greg saw a flash of fear in his eyes. "I already told you," he whispered hoarsely. "They'll come for me. They won't stop until they get me." Greg placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I know they will, but I want you to understand. This goes much deeper than we thought. There's a reason they want you. Something to do with a government project. It's called Project Sentinel, and they've been looking for you for a long time." Liam's eyes widened, and for a moment, he said nothing. His lips parted, as though he was struggling to find the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. I remember hearing things when I was little," he murmured. "Whispers, strange people in dark suits. They said they were part of something big, but I didn't understand. I thought it was just a dream. But now, I don't know what's real anymore." Greg's heart ached for the boy. The pain and confusion in Liam's voice were palpable. He had been living with these shadows, these fragmented memories, for as long as he could remember. And now, they were coming for him in full force. "You're not alone, Liam," Greg said firmly, locking eyes with the boy. "I'm not going to let them take you. Whatever this is, we're going to figure it out, together." Liam looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "But how?" he whispered. "How can you stop them? They always find me. They know where I am. It's like they can see inside my mind." Greg's heart sank as he heard the despair in Liam's voice. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Whoever was hunting the boy wasn't just skilled. They were powerful. But Greg wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close to the truth. "We're going to start by finding out everything we can about Project Sentinel," Greg said, determination creeping into his voice. "And then we're going to make sure no one ever finds you again." Liam looked skeptical, but he nodded. "You'll need more than just information. They're not just watching me. They're watching everything. Every step I take, every move I make." Greg's mind began to churn. He had always prided himself on his investigative skills, but this was a whole new ball game. Whatever Project Sentinel was, it wasn't just a Black Ops mission. It had a level of secrecy and control that went beyond anything Greg had ever encountered. "I'll reach out to some people I trust," Greg said, his voice low. "We'll need resources, and we'll need to move fast. But first, I need to get you out of here. We can't stay in one place for too long. If they know where you are, they'll come looking." Liam hesitated but then nodded. "Where will we go?" Greg's mind whirled as he considered the options. The shelter wasn't safe anymore. Not with the people searching for Liam. Not with the shadows closing in on them. They needed to go off the grid, somewhere that no one would find them. somewhere far from the prying eyes of whoever was pulling the strings in this dark conspiracy. "I've got a friend who owes me a favor," Greg said, his voice resolute. "We'll head there first. He's got a place where we can lay low for a while. It's isolated. We'll be safe there." Liam seemed to draw some comfort from the idea of getting away from the city, from the constant fear that seemed to hang over him like a cloud. But Greg could see the boy's anxiety was far from gone. The weight of his past, of the unknown forces after him, still gripped him tightly. As Greg helped Liam gather his things, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. The more he thought about Project Sentinel, the more questions came to mind. What had they done to Liam? What was this special ability that the boy seemed to have? Was it just some genetic anomaly, or was there something more to it? And who were these people, these dark figures in suits that had been tracking Liam since he was a child? Greg knew he had to get answers. He had to understand what had happened to Liam before it was too late. He couldn't let the boy slip through his fingers now. He couldn't let whatever darkness haunted Liam's past consume him any longer. Once they were packed, Greg and Liam made their way to the car, the quiet streets around them offering little comfort. As they drove through the city, the weight of the journey ahead loomed over them. They were stepping into the unknown, and there was no telling what dangers lay ahead. But Greg wasn't scared. Not anymore. This wasn't just about keeping Liam safe. It was about uncovering the truth. And no matter what it took, Greg would follow the trail, piece by piece, until he understood everything. He owed it to Liam. The road stretched out before them, dark and winding, a path toward a future filled with uncertainty and a danger. But for the first time in a long time, Greg felt the stirrings of hope. They might not know exactly what they were up against, but they had each other. And sometimes that was enough to face the most impossible odds. As the car sped into the night, Greg's thoughts turned to the one question that had been haunting him since the moment he first met Liam. What had happened to the boy's family? What had Project Sentinel done to him? And more importantly, what were they planning to do next? The edge of truth. The car hummed quietly as it sped along the empty highway, the headlights cutting through the night like two piercing beams of hope. Greg's grip on the wheel was steady, but his mind was a swirling storm of questions, each one more unsettling than the last. The air felt thick, suffused with an ominous energy that seemed to tighten around him with each mile they put behind them. Liam sat in the passenger seat, his eyes unfocused, staring out of the window into the darkness. He had barely said a word since they left the shelter, and Greg could tell that the weight of their situation was starting to settle on the boy's shoulders. The past few days had been a blur of fear, confusion, and rapid decisions. But now, on the open road, with nowhere else to run, the enormity of their predicament was inescapable. "Are you okay?" Greg asked, his voice soft, but it carried the weight of concern. He glanced over at Liam, who seemed miles away in his thoughts. Liam blinked, as if pulled out of a trance. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the engine. "I'm scared. I've been running my whole life, and every time I think I can breathe, they find me again. I don't even know who they are. Greg, how can I fight something I don't understand?" Greg's heart broke for the boy. The fear in his voice was raw, like a wound that had never healed. The world Liam had known had been one of constant danger, always on the move, always hiding. And now, they were caught in the grip of something even darker, a shadow that stretched across his entire life. It wasn't just a chase anymore. It was an intricate web of secrets, lies, and hidden forces that wanted to pull Liam back into a world he had been running from since he could remember. "You're not alone in this, Liam," Greg said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm going to help you. Whatever happens, we're in this together. You don't have to face this alone." Liam's eyes met Greg's for the briefest moment, and for a second, Greg could see a flicker of hope there, a fleeting glimpse of the boy he could be, if only the world hadn't been so cruel. Then the darkness returned, that haunting emptiness that seemed to swallow up all the good in him, leaving only fear and uncertainty. They didn't speak much after that. The silence between them was heavy, but neither of them seemed to know what else to say. The road stretched ahead, the darkness surrounding them as though it were closing in on all sides. There was a sense of finality to the journey they were on. One way or another, they were heading towards something neither of them fully understood. The drive took them out of the city, away from the bustling streets and crowded neighborhoods. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the deep, velvety blackness of the countryside. The landscape was empty and desolate, a reflection of the isolation they both felt. The world outside seemed distant, unreal, like it had no connection to the strange path they were walking. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at their destination. It was a small, unassuming cabin nestled in a secluded patch of woods. From the outside, it looked like just another forgotten place. Quiet, abandoned, safe from the prying eyes of the world. It was the perfect place to lay low, to hide from whatever was tracking them. Greg had known the owner of the cabin for years, a former colleague who owed him more than one favor. He parked the car, and the two of them sat there for a moment, taking in the eerie stillness of their surroundings. The air was thick with tension, and Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as alone as they thought. "We'll be safe here," Greg said, trying to reassure both himself and Liam, but his voice faltered slightly, as though he wasn't entirely sure. "We just need to keep a low profile until I can find out more about Project Sentinel. I've got a contact who can help us get some answers." Liam didn't respond immediately. He just stared out of the windshield, his eyes narrowed as if he were trying to see through the darkness itself. There was something unsettling about the way he was looking at the cabin, as though he could sense something lurking, just beyond the edge of the light. "Greg," Liam said finally, his voice distant, "I don't think we're alone." Greg's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Liam pointed toward the edge of the woods, where the trees cast long, twisting shadows in the dim moonlight. "I can feel them. I felt them before. It's like they're watching us." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, but he knew better than to dismiss Liam's instincts. The boy had been running from something for so long. His ability to sense danger had been sharpened over the years. And if he said they were being watched, Greg wasn't about to ignore it. "Stay in the car," Greg said, his voice low and commanding. "I'm going to check things out. If there's someone out there, I'll handle it." Liam hesitated but nodded, his eyes wide with fear. Greg could see the boy's mind racing. The years of trauma, the years of running from shadows, were taking their toll. But there was something else in Liam's gaze now, something almost resigned, as if he had grown too used to this kind of danger. Greg got out of the car and approached the cabin slowly, his senses heightened. The stillness of the woods was unsettling, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he reached the door. He paused, listening intently. The only sound he could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft creak of the trees swaying. But there was something beneath that, a sense of movement, a presence that he couldn't quite identify. He opened the door cautiously, stepping into the cabin's dim interior. The place was quiet, almost eerily so. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years, but there was a strange chill to it, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He moved further inside, checking the windows, the corners, the darkened shadows where anything could be hiding. He was a police officer, trained to scan his surroundings for danger. But there was something different about this situation. It wasn't just a matter of petty crime, or the usual threats he dealt with. This was something far more insidious, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of their lives for far too long. He reached the back of the cabin, where there was a small locked door leading to a basement. He had to take a deep breath before opening it. He didn't know what he expected to find down there. But whatever it wasn't going to be good. But before Greg could take another step toward the door, A soft sound made him freeze in his tracks. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees outside. "Greg." The voice whispered, low and hollow. His blood ran cold. "Liam." Without thinking, Greg turned and ran toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, something stopped him. A sudden flash of movement outside the window. A figure, dark and fleeting, moved through the trees. It wasn't human. The silhouette was too tall, too unnatural. And then everything went silent. Liam was gone. Greg's heart thundered in his chest as he burst out of the cabin, his eyes frantically scanning the woods. But all he could see were the shadows, stretching like tendrils through the night. And somewhere, hidden in those shadows, he knew they were coming for him.